Welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing examples of the rhetorical appeal pathos and examining how pathos can change in its manifestation depending on what type of medium or text it appears in. So let's review quickly what pathos is. As we covered before, there are three persuasive appeals, these being ethos, pathos, and logos. We've established ethos previously, and this is the appeal to credibility. Pathos is the appeal to emotion, specifically the emotions of the audience in the rhetorical situation or triangle. And logos refers to appeals to logic. Of these three, pathos is the one that is most commonly used, is also the one that is most effective. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Pathos, obviously, in appealing to the emotions of the audience, does not really need significant prior knowledge to work. Most everyone, regardless of their education level, regardless of their upbringing, regardless of their cultural background, is familiar with their emotions, right? They're familiar with the emotions of happiness, anger, sadness, etc. And a well-trained speaker writer is aware of this and knows how to evoke certain emotions, even despite cultural differences, linguistic differences, and so on. So pathos, for that reason, tends to be the most commonly used. It's the most effective because it appeals to the greatest amount of people. It just in general doesn't take a lot of effort to employ. So it's often in any given text, if one is working with persuasive strategies, pathos tends to be the most common. This doesn't mean that pathos is the most reliable. So as we know, emotional appeals tend to also be very weak. Appeals to logic tend to be stronger, but because they require more effort to both use and to trigger, to register in audiences, they tend to be less used. So pathos by default becomes one of the most commonly used, most effective, but again, does not mean that it will always be necessarily well reasoned or established in good faith. And many emotional appeals can be fallacious and they can be created in bad faith, or they don't have to necessarily sit on sound logic or reasoning. Okay, so let's look at examples of pathos. Like the other appeals, pathos changes in the way that it appears depending on a text. So in a speech, pathos will look different than what it does in a commercial, and both will look different than what pathos might appear to be in an essay. So like with our examination of ethos, we'll create a chart here. So we'll start with speech. We'll have essay. And then our last category will be advertisement, which can include and encompass commercials and static advertisements such as billboards and posters. So let's think about some of the ways that pathos might manifest in each of these three different types of texts or medium. In a speech, because speeches tend to be more detail driven, they're less detail driven, essays are more detail driven. Because speeches are performed, as it were, the body language and gesticulation of the speaker can go a long way in creating an emotional response in the audience. So we have body language as well as gesticulation being the gestures of the speaker. So it's well known that when publicly speaking, a speaker should be relatively dynamic, not moving the entire time during a speech and not behaving erratically. That will just be distracting, but moving enough to engage the interest of the audience. Another way that pathos will appear in a speech can occur if the speech uses what are known as visual aids. So it's possible that a speaker will use visual aids to create an emotional response. These could be pictures, it could be slideshow presentations, and so on. There may even be the use of music throughout a speech. That's uncommon, but it is possible. And obviously the visual aids can have a strong impact or effect on an audience. Images can be, especially if they're very graphic or sensational, can evoke a very powerful response. So the phrase picture says 1,000 words can have a lot of effectiveness here. One way that speakers tend to appeal to their audiences are also through the use of anecdotes. So an anecdote is a way of creating a personal connection between the audience and the speaker. The speaker is trying to raise his or her credibility. And by doing this, we'll use an anecdote, which is like a personal story, as a means of establishing a kind of common history or common experience, shared experience between the audience and the speaker. Anecdotes can range from the humorous. So many speakers will try to be funny, and they will talk about a kind of humorous or lighthearted event or moment from their past. It might also be tragic. So most people can relate to the loss of a loved one or some kind of financial catastrophe or disaster. And so some speakers will use that as their anecdote. And they typically open up their speeches with these little stories. And again, this kind of grounds the topic of what they're going to discuss, as well as create that personal connection. So anecdotes can be a very powerful way for a speaker to introduce a speech, and then also to intermittently kind of shake it up and make it more engaging. Just as an aside, if a public speaker uses stories every so often, that is a good way of refreshing the interest of the audience. In addition to, again, conservatively moving across the stage, maintaining an appropriate tone of voice, as well as body language, and so on. Now, many of these strategies can also apply to an essay, barring, of course, the visual aids and the body language, but anecdotes for sure can be used in essays. So we'll also include anecdotes here. Essays, because of their richness and detail and written detail, also tend to feature a lot of imagery and figurative language. And so the effect of imagery and figurative language is obvious. Just as if one were reading a novel or a short story, descriptive details can really ground a reader into the anecdote or story, or I guess experience of the writing that is being conveyed. And so if a writer is talking about an anecdote from his or her past, or trying to illustrate an example, imagery and other descriptive details can work very well in setting the reader into that imaginative space more effectively, and thus make the experience of the writing, the point of the anecdote, the point of the story, more powerful. So an effective writer will use imagery and figurative language, not necessarily excessively, but in kind of sparse, conservative, powerful ways to forward a point. And again, this typically has to do with establishing stories or reinforcing anecdotes. We also can see things in essays such as irony and sarcasm. So depending on the voice of the writer, some writers will be more journalistic or more sparse. They will tend to be more objective. Other writers might be more subjective. And so depending on the style of the writer might be looser with his or her use of irony and sarcasm. Obviously, this can create sensations of comedy, can also create sensations of disgust, sensations of fear, etc. A really powerful example of a piece of written satire would be a Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, which was written, I believe, in the 16 or 1700s in response to English treatment of the Irish potato famine. And so in that essay, Swift takes on a very kind of clinical tone when he's describing his quote unquote modest proposal, which would be to consume children and infants in response to the potato famine. And so obviously he is not meant to be taken seriously. He doesn't mean that in a genuine way, but the absurdity of his proposal and the manner in which he presents it to the reader is supposed to evoke disgust and revulsion, right? And to really sell the estate of the Irish during this period. So this is a good example of using pathos to make a point, right? And there's a black humor involved, but again, satire is very powerful in this respect because satire, again, uses humor to socially critique. And so Swift does this very effectively in that essay. Let's look at the last category, which would be advertisements. And these can include, again, commercials and static advertisements such as billboards, posters, and so on. Because of the visual nature of these, which are even more visual than speeches, we tend to see a lot of imagery in these advertisements. It's very rare that we will actually see someone speaking. Sometimes this happens, especially if a celebrity or expert is used, and that would be an example of ethos overlapping with pathos. So the celebrity or expert lends a certain degree of credibility to the advertisement. But usually what we see instead are a lot of imagery. We also have a lot of music being used. So music becomes possible when looking at a commercial, for example, or a movie trailer. The music can heighten the feelings that are meant to be evoked by the imagery. Furthermore, we also see this sometimes with commercials, which is storytelling. So some commercials will use a kind of basic storytelling conceits to help sell whatever product they are trying to advertise. This could be something as simple as a advertisement that is meant to promote kind of common courtesy or good etiquette. And so we see sometimes someone returning something that was stolen to someone else. That would be an example of a kind of light storytelling touch. There are noticeable characters. The characters are relatable to the audience. They behave in ways that demonstrate to the audience what the advertisement wants to suggest, or they create a positive association with what the advertisement is talking about in general. Advertisements, again, are meant to sell a product, or again, to promote a certain type of idea. But usually the point is to create a positive association between whatever that is and the audience. So keep in mind too, that there is a calculated component to a commercial, to an advertisement. The creators of the ad are making assumptions about what will most effectively trigger an audience's reactions to things. What you will see often in commercials, so another example of this would be commercials that are designed usually by organizations like PETA and so on to convince people to sponsor or adopt animals. Usually there will be a lot of sad, mournful music accompanied by images of animals and pounds and animal shelters looking very unkempt, malnourished, lonely, etc. And this is supposed to, again, create that sense of pity in the audience and the viewer to prompt him or her to do the action that the advertisement wants. So again, even though the imagery and other music and storytelling elements can be very powerful, never forget that those are all calculated. Someone is storyboarding that advertisement, someone is greenlighting it, someone is writing it. It's all calculated to produce a very particular response, and that particular response is predicated on certain assumptions being made about the audience. So all of this is to say that pathos, again, appears differently depending on what type of medium or text is being used to convey the message. But nonetheless, despite speech, essay, and advertisements all being different in terms of their form, they all have the same purpose, which is to convince or to promote a certain type of thinking, feeling, or behavior on the part of the audience. So the speaker, the writer, and the creator of the advertisements all have the shared goal in common, which is to persuade the audience to think, feel, or do something. And so pathos can be used to promote this thinking. Again, it's very important to remember that pathos can be used in bad faith, can be used very disingenuously. So simply because pathos is being used, simply because it can be effective. So simply because, for example, a slippery soap fallacy, which suggests that something negative will happen because something else happened, just because that might inspire fear in people and prompt them to behave, does not mean that the actual rhetorical strategy or the fallacy is something based in logic and reasoning. So it's important to keep in mind always that pathos is very easy to use, but it can also have very damaging repercussions, and it can be disastrous if not used responsibly. So there is a burden of responsibility on the part of speakers, writers, and so on to use the rhetorical strategies in good faith, and to avoid providing incorrect information to their audiences simply because they want to elicit a certain response. In any case, I hope you now have greater clarity about the way pathos can be used in persuasive texts. We will next be looking at how logos manifests in different types of persuasive texts.